students. Welcome back to our next lesson in stewardship. Hopefully you remember from yesterday what stewardship is, and remember also that stewardship is a broader topic than what we are focusing on here this week. Stewardship can apply to any natural resource here on planet Earth, but as I mentioned to you yesterday, today we're going to be focusing primarily on the biological resources as we follow up from last week's discussion on biodiversity. And also another reason for that, when we consider the life forms on our planet, all of those living things, including us, our mere existence is dependent upon our ability to utilize effectively the natural resources that we have. So whether we are talking about the stewardship of mineral resources or fossil fuel resources or energy resources, all of that ultimately boils down to an appropriate stewardship of living things and the life forms that exist here on planet Earth. Because if we fail to be good stewards of those living things, none of the other things matter because, well, we won't be here. So let's continue where we picked up yesterday as we explore methods of stewardship. And we'll begin today by addressing one of the biggest losses of biodiversity we mentioned last week, which was the loss of habitats. And so today, this week, we have an opportunity to turn that around and discuss methods of how we can promote stewardship, which is the opposite of losing biodiversity. And item number one on the list is, in fact, preserving habitats. And when we refer to habitats, we're not just talking about terrestrial habitats, but marine habitats as well. Water environments as well as land environments are incredibly important and host to a variety of species. So what are some things we can do to preserve habitats? Well, we can set up what are called preserves or reserves. Last week, we made mention of the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge, and we talked about how it was planned to be this gigantic jet port in the Northeast, but because of the actions of a small number of people initially, it grew into a mass movement to eventually protect the Great Swamp and designate it a National Wildlife Refuge. And it's right here in our own state of New Jersey. Thousands of acres are now preserved, promoting the stewardship of the habitats of thousands of different species. If you have yet to take a trip there with your family or friends, you must check out the Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge. It is absolutely a beautiful location, and don't let the word swamp confuse you into thinking that there's nothing there but alligators, because, well, there are no alligators in the Great Swamp. Lots and lots of birds and mammal species. A little bit closer to our school is the Paulinskill Wildlife Management Area. And even in our own township, we've got the Buckhorn Creek Wildlife Management Area. We've got the Pequest Wildlife Management Area. You can go around our township and our county and see lots of wildlife management areas. These are all preserves, which are areas that are set aside specifically for preservation. And when we say preservation, it refers to preserving an area or something the way it is naturally. So these preserves are set aside primarily for the indigenous indigenous organisms that thrive and live in those environments. Another way to preserve habitats is through the use of parks. Now, parks are a little bit different than preserves. With a preserve, you can visit a preserve, but you need to leave it exactly as you found it. You shouldn't manipulate the land in any way or the organisms that live there. But a park is a little bit different. Parks are multi-use concepts for preservation and recreation. And when we talk about recreation, we're introducing humans into the environment in a way that we can use those areas a little bit more for fun and enjoyment. When you visit a preserve, you are a visitor to the wildlife. When you visit a park, you become part of the wildlife, so to speak. I think that's a good way of thinking about the difference between a preserve and a park. And you can typically do other things in parks. They might have designated areas for humans, like picnic areas or playgrounds and so forth. But there's another way of preserving habitats as well. And in our state of New Jersey, this is typically done on a local level, and it is called zoning. You see, every township in our state, or every town or city in our state, have zoning boards or planning boards that designate different parts of their municipality as areas that might be sensitive to the needs of organisms, species, plant or animal species that live there, and might be better off left alone as opposed to developing those areas strictly for human use. And so there are different kinds of zoning that can be done at the local as well as the regional level to control various things, such as how big your piece of property should be, whether people should be clustered into smaller areas with a higher population density, like a housing development should be clustered together to leave more open space around it to allow for habitat of other organisms. And oftentimes these zoning or planning boards will develop maps that look like this, and these maps have different regions designated. Like on this particular map, here's a river flowing through Utica, New York, and this whole blue area is a floodplain. So you probably don't want to be building lots of homes on the floodplain because people are going to be flooded out eventually. So, but you could have other uses like parks. It doesn't matter if a park might get flooded out. People can enjoy those areas when the floods don't exist. But when the flood happens, it won't impact people. You can have zones of forest land or open space and designate more urban areas in specific corridors or pathways in order to enable a town to have more open space designated for the preserving of habitat or other areas as well. So those three things, preserves, parks, and zoning, are three ways that we can preserve habitats. That's number one. So let's go on to number two. Number two way or method of stewardship is raising the reproductive rates of endangered or threatened organisms. We have a couple of great examples. One of these we're going to be doing a lab activity on later this week, the whooping crane, which is coming back from near extinction. But in 1940, as we'll discover in our lab activity, in the 1940s, the whooping crane was almost gone. Nowadays, in the 21st century, the population is increasing, but it took a lot of effort in order to allow for that to happen. Likewise, the African elephant was nearly hunted to extinction in the early part of the 20th century. Thankfully, now the population has grown markedly. Both of these examples are of raising the reproductive rates, and there are different ways that that can be accomplished. First way is through something called captive breeding. And if we look at this picture here, this is actually a chick of a California condor. California condors are famous for being the largest bird in North America. I think their wingspan is almost 10 feet long. That's about as long as the ceiling in the classrooms are high. These are big birds, but they have been brought to the brink of extinction, really close. And one of the things that we're doing now is breeding them in captivity. Now, it sounds like a great idea. Get some eggs that they've laid in nature, bring them into a controlled environment, and foster the development of the egg and raise the chicks as they hatch and reintroduce them into nature to more guarantee the population numbers. But it's not quite that easy. You see, there's something in the bird species called imprinting. And birds, when they first hatch, tend to be imprinted or become associated with the first living thing they see. In nature, that is typically their mother or their father. But if they are bred captively, well, then they're inclined to be imprinted on a human being. And that would be a very dangerous thing for a wild bird to do, because then they become too comfortable and familiar with humans, which essentially are their biggest threat in the natural environment. And so the California condor is really a success story in captive breeding, because great lengths are taken to disguise the humans taking care of the captively bred chicks. As this picture illustrates, we use puppets. Believe it or not, we use puppets in the shape of a California condor parent to feed the chicks. So the chicks think the puppet is a real bird and is imprinted on their own species instead of the human species. And so that's a good thing. That's a good thing. In more severe circumstances where a species is so close to extinction we can't even think of anything to do to help them at this time, what we have taken steps to do is freeze them. Yes, it is true. It's called cryogenics. Cryogenics is the practice of essentially freezing organisms or parts of organisms in the hopes that someday in the future, technology will exist that will enable us to bring this species back from extinction. Now, the organism on the left here is not on the brink of extinction. You may recognize this little critter. This is a water bear. Water bears are incredibly resilient creatures, and we can learn a lot from them because water bears, as well as certain species of toads, can actually be frozen, nearly frozen solid, and then thawed out and rejuvenated back to life. And we need to learn more from these organisms on how to do that when we're talking about trying to preserve the existence of species that are on the brink of extinction. So we do have species. We have stored some species in liquid nitrogen, very cool environments, in order to hope that in the future we might be able to bring them back from where they are now. All right, let's get into number 3. The third method of stewardship is setting limits. This is probably the easiest thing to do. And if you like to fish or hunt, you are familiar with the setting of limits, Because when you get your fishing license, for instance, you are instructed on what species you can fish for and which ones you can keep and which ones need to be thrown back. You're given restrictions on what size fish you are allowed to keep. And if they're too young, you need to throw them back so that they can reproduce. If you are a hunter of either deer or bear, the state of New Jersey has identified different regions of hunting throughout the state in order to manage the population size of these game animals, the deer and the bear, and other things as well, small game also, because the populations may be higher in certain regions and lower in other regions. And so hunting, legal hunting, is a method of managing populations. And that is extremely important, especially in a very densely populated state like our own in New Jersey, because in addition to the wildlife that exists here, we've got the most densely populated area in the world of human beings as well. And so it's very important to manage and be good stewards of the wildlife population so as to avoid conflicts with the human populations. And so instead of allowing populations of deer, let's say, explode uncontrolled so that they end up being hit by every car that goes down the road, we can control the population and keep it below what's called the carrying capacity, which we learned about earlier in the year, in order to manage the size of the population as it interacts with our own population. It's a much way of doing that. And in addition to hunting, there are also restrictions that can be set. There are areas, like in preserves for that matter, where there is no hunting permitted in order to allow certain species to build up their populations. And maybe there's no hunting ever in certain areas, or maybe there's no hunting in that region for a period of time until a population increases. But regardless, placing restrictions, setting limits, hunting, these are ways that we can prevent organisms from going extinct and balance population demands between one species and another. The fourth method of stewardship is called activism and education. There's an acronym called ACT, ACT, that says action changes things. In other words, if you want something to change, you got to do something to make those changes occur. And so activism is one way that that can happen. Because when you educate people, in fact, I strongly believe this, that if you educate most people about the importance of preserving certain species of organisms, I think most people, having been educated, will understand the importance of being a good steward and will learn on their own steps that they can take to help avoid the extinction of another species on our planet. And so promoting public awareness, I believe, is essential, especially in regards to stewardship, in order for it to be effective. And history is chock full of examples of activism, promoting public awareness, and having things change. So with that in mind, we're going to halt our notes for today because I have some videos that I would like to show you that really drive this point home. And so until we meet next time, I'll say bye-bye.